support this very important bill, as you just outlined. And just looking here at the Progressives Manifesto in regards to this area, I'd like to read this public document, with your permission, a segment from it, which says that
So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The People's Progressive Movement has a record of honesty and integrity in office, of which we are very proud, and we intend to build on that and to further strengthen the institutions of government to protect abuse of office and corrupt practices by those in government. We are the party that passed the Freedom of Information Law in 2007, and we are the party that passed the Anti-Corruption Law in 2008. We shall continue to uphold the highest standards of good governance by, and the very first one, Mr. Speaker, enacting legislation to give effect to the Commission for Standards in Public Life. That is followed by some other important stuff that some yet to come. But I use that as a platform, Mr. Speaker, to start my short contribution today on this landmark piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, it's based on the Nolan principles, as we've heard, which are well known. And, Mr. Speaker, it certainly accords with my own feeling in regards to honesty and integrity, and especially when it comes to someone else's funds or property. It also, as my colleague from Georgetown referred to, as he also was trained as an accountant and went on to become a partner at one of the big law accounting firms here. The fact that the training as an accountant, one of the things you have to learn to live with, and of course not all do, but those of us who believe in ethics will certainly know that we believe in accountability and honest representation when it comes to dealing with other people's money and their records. Mr. Speaker, I've always said when people talk about the police or people in authority harassing them, I've always said to them, if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear. You certainly, even if you are charged, your day in court will come and you will be exonerated. So I have nothing to fear with legislation such as this, which is certainly a very strong piece of legislation, and it applies across the public sector, starting with us here in Parliament and extending itself into the civil service and other public officials. Schedule 1 lays out the various categories, and it's, like I said, it starts with members of the Legislative Assembly, chief officers and deputy chief officers, chief financial officers and deputy chief financial officers, heads of departments, chief executives of statutory authorities, members of governing bodies, of governing bodies of statutory authorities, and members of governing bodies of government companies, members of all commissions created by or under the Constitution, and a person holding a full-time or part-time position in a public authority. So, just about everybody, I think, when it comes to public office, is being held accountable once they've reached a certain level of seniority. And of course, people who will serve on boards as we move forward. Mr. Speaker, I think that there will be those among us who will be concerned with legislation such as this. I think it will be largely accepted and largely welcomed because Cayman, Mr. Speaker, is built and has been built on good governance. When we go overseas to promote these islands or when we deal with them from within, one of the first things that we put up on that board or on that screen is good governance, stability, an honest environment. Those are the things that we sell, not just the sand, sea, and sun. And these are the things that concern investors and concern people that want to do business with the Cayman Islands. The fact that they know they can come here and not find corrupt practices and corrupt politicians and corrupt officials to buy their way rather than earn their way. Mr. Speaker, I'm not here to throw any stones, but certainly we've all heard over the years the many accusations and innuendos when it comes to corrupt practices in our island. And it has been a matter of concern, and we've seen countries where this has taken them right down to the bottom. And we don't want to join that group of countries, Mr. Speaker. We need to be able to hold our head up high and say that the Cayman Islands is one of the leaders in governance, one of the leaders in transparency, one of the best places to do business, and give the confidence to people to attract the right people. Because, Mr. Speaker, bad governments attract bad people, and good governments attract good people. And I like to think that I'm a part of a good government, and I've always been, and I think that what we're seeing now is testament to that, because the people that we're seeing wanting to do business here are people that we, although we have to screen and do due diligence on, are largely in part good people that are now saying, we want to come back to these islands to do business. We wouldn't come beforehand. So this is why legislation such as this and anti-corruption law and all the other freedom of information and everything else goes hand in hand with, Mr. Speaker, because we cannot underestimate the importance of this. Mr. Speaker, since 2005 to 2009 I was elected, and now I'm back since last year. And one of the things that hurts me and hurts to the core sometimes is the bad name that the word politician, or the bad reputation that the word politician engenders. And it's hearing more and more, or you're one of them. They don't care which side you're on, you're one of them. We need to change that image, and yes, we'll always take our licks. Politicians is the nature of the business. Politics is an adversarial business. But we want to be able to say that we are a government in large part, and I'm speaking on both sides of this House, Mr. Speaker, that people will look at and admire and say those people, whether they're on my side or the other side, they are honest, they're hardworking, they're doing their best for these islands. Legislation such as this, Mr. Speaker, will ensure that we go a long way towards cleaning that image up. Of course, Mr. Speaker, it starts with the people that you elect. You have to elect the right people, you have to appoint the right people, because no legislation in the world will be foolproof against someone who wants to get around it. But we have to make sure that when we put ourselves forward for public office, that we do so bearing in mind that we are simply a custodian of our people's assets, our people's reputation, and we have a big responsibility. And I take that very seriously, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned before that people being appointed to our boards, some may find this a bit challenging, and as was said earlier by the member from East End, we live in a small society, and it is always a challenge under the best of circumstances to find good people to help and to step forward and throw their hat in the ring for love of country, because being on a board is certainly not a financially rewarding position, or it shouldn't be. And therefore, we know that as a government, we know that this, we've discussed this, we know that this will not ease the process, that's for sure, but we are prepared to take that risk because it's worth it. We have board members who naturally will have conflicts of interest, and it is for them, and hopefully the board has enough members on it that are not in that position, that they recuse themselves and allow the business to continue. I hope that we don't have a situation where too many people too often would have to leave a room and we don't have a quorum. But that is not impossible either. But, Mr. Speaker, I think that it is very, very important that we show the highest degree of integrity when it comes to our business practices and what we are doing on this country's behalf. The fact that we are moving more and more towards open board meetings and open committee meetings, I'm sure will also enhance this process. Mr. Speaker, the legislation, well, a commission is being set up under this legislation, and they will have a very, very important job, a very important role to play. And we have to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that they are given all the tools and resources that it will take for them to do their job properly. We have to first of all put the right people on that commission, which the bill calls for certain areas to be represented and certain people to be on. But their job, Mr. Speaker, is a very, very important one, and I'd like to just run through a few of the various tasks that they'll be assigned with. The functions of the Commission, per Section 5, Mr. Speaker, is to assist in the setting of the highest standards of integrity and competence in public life in order to ensure the prevention of corruption or conflicts of interest, to monitor standards of ethical conduct in the Legislative Assembly, the Cabinet, and on the part of public authorities and public officers, to supervise the operations of the Register of Interest and to investigate breaches of established standards, to review and establish procedures for awarding public contracts. That's a big one. To review and establish procedures for appointing members to public authorities and the terms of their appointments. To recommend codes of conduct to prevent any minister, public authority, or public officer employing their power for any personal benefit or advantage, and to recommend legislation to provide appropriate sanctions. To report to the Legislative Assembly at regular intervals and at least every 6 months, and to exercise such of the functions as may be prescribed by this or any other law. That's a large job, Mr. Speaker. It's a very, very important one, because we have seen too often, and we've heard, not just on the political side, because I think oftentimes the politicians get all the licks, but there are the arms to government. They're the judicial and the administrative arms. And we have heard many times accusations thrown across the bow of each of those. And therefore, it is very, very important that we are seen to be very fair in terms of the justice meted out. But at the same time, as the Honorable Attorney General pointed out, we have to protect those that are bringing these situations to light. And we have to ensure that justice is swift. Justice delayed is justice denied, Mr. Speaker. Learned that much in law. And oftentimes we see things being drawn out and drawn out and drawn out until they gradually fade away. We trust that this legislation will go some way towards stopping that type of behavior in these Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, it's a very proud day to stand here yet again with another iconic piece of legislation being passed by this government. The recent conservation law was another such day. And we will continue to do what is right to protect the reputation and these Cayman Islands, the reputation of and these islands, Mr. Speaker. Because without that, as you like to say sometimes, dog eat our supper. If we don't uphold those principles and create an environment and maintain an environment of honesty, accountability, and transparency, because our economy is one that is based on finance and on tourism largely, we will see that the golden goose will fly away and we won't have any more golden eggs. We have challenging times right now in these Cayman Islands, but it would be a lot harder, I dare say, if we didn't have our financial industry. And they will be the first to take flight when things go haywire. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So, once again, I'd like to offer my full support for this legislation. I intend certainly to abide by it. I know my government does, and I'm sure members of Parliament, all members of Parliament, will feel the same. I want to thank all those who have worked extremely hard over the past few years on this, Mr. Speaker. And I also want to commend our Premier for introducing it to this honorable House. With those few words, Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? I recognize the Minister of Health, Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was wondering if you were giving me another subject matter to add to my very long list of responsibilities. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I, too, would like to publicly lend my support to this bill and to say that I am proud to be a member of this government that is bringing this very important piece of legislation forward for consideration by this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, as you may be aware and remember, I campaigned very much on the theme of it being time for a new generation of leaders. Leaders who are willing to stand by our convictions, leaders who are willing to tackle the important issues such as this bill that we have before us today, and as my colleague from the District of Georgetown mentioned most recently, the National Conservation Bill, which was also seen as a important but thorny issue, this government tackled that within the first 6 months of office. And so, Mr. Speaker, it's important that the country recognize, and I think the country has spoken when they elected the members of this honorable House. Many of us campaigned along formal political lines. Many of us, myself including, didn't. We campaigned as independent-minded leaders who are willing to work together for the betterment of this country. And, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to say that this too, bringing this bill forward and putting this bill in legislation, and hopefully now taking it forward with respect to the implementation, was a political promise of myself and other members of the independent candidates, then independent members on the government bench now. Because, Mr. Speaker, we also saw the fact that this is a crucial piece of legislation that we need to ensure that the pillars of our democracy remain strong, remain sturdy, remain rooted on truth and justice, and preserving and protecting our future prosperity as a country. Mr. Speaker, smart, honest, independent-minded leaders working together have proven to be able to form a government that will draw strength from similarities but also diversity of ideas. Mr. Speaker, what this piece of legislation does is it gives some teeth to what has become a very fashionable buzzword, good governance. We now have legislation that actually helps to create the underlying teeth which will help to operationalize the Nolan principles by which we should all be living as leaders in this country. Mr. Speaker, I too support the committee stage amendments that will be coming forward, in that there were a number of concerns that I had that have been addressed in those as well, with respect to ensuring that we can still hold and maintain the highest level of governance amongst our non-elected officials, so to speak, the persons that will be acting in a public capacity on boards, ensuring that what is required of them is balanced and is reasonable given the role that we are asking them to do, but the role that they are agreeing to do by agreeing to sit on these boards. Mr. Speaker, the hard work has now begun. Based on comments said thus far, I anticipate that this bill will pass, hopefully will pass unopposed, and now the work to educate the public on what it means to be in a potential or a possible situation of conflict of interest, and what a conflict of interest entails is an important one. Because, Mr. Speaker, as we heard earlier, conflicts arise on a daily basis. Some of them are avoidable, some of them unavoidable, but it is our job as a society to learn to recognize these conflicts, and if they are in a situation that puts us as elected representatives or puts the leaders of this country in terms of the civil service and other members of statutory boards and otherwise, it is now not only left up to our conscience to act accordingly, but this legislation actually makes it a requirement to act according to those principles of good governance. And for that, Mr. Speaker, we are only stronger as a democracy, stronger as a country, and stronger as a people, because we can say, and And again, assuming that this legislation does pass this honorable House, we will be in a position to state unequivocally that we not only believe in the principle of good governance, but we intend to abide by such. So with that, I just say thank you to the Premier, and again, I am proud to be a part of this government to bring this piece of legislation forward.
Does any other member wish to speak? Honorable Minister for Financial Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start off by congratulating the Premier for the good work that has been done on this bill with the team. For the benefit of the listening public, of course, those members of Cabinet have already demonstrated their commitment to this bill by approving it to be tabled. So it's not necessary to really spend a lot of time, and I have to say I probably don't intend to spend a lot of time talking about it. It is clear, and I think the country, having elected a government that they feel is trustworthy, it is clear that this piece of legislation is exactly the sort of thing they would expect the government to be bringing forward. The Standards in Public Life Commission was put in place by the 2009 Constitution, and from a private perspective, being outside government, observing what was going on, it has been a source of frustration for me since then that this piece of legislation had not been brought by the previous governments to give the Commission the tools and the legs that it needed to function effectively. So I am, of course, very happy, very pleased that we are now bringing this piece of legislation forward to support and give effect to that very important commission, which is part of several other commissions, which was created by Part 8 of the Constitution, essentially as institutions to support our democracy. Mr. Speaker, if we have these institutions in place, fully operational, there is no doubt that they function well and will function well to improve our democracy, to take it forward. And one of the biggest things that I think this bill in particular will do for the people of this country is to give them the opportunity to have trust. Because it is a very fashionable thing around the world these days to distrust politicians, distrust political groups, distrust those that function in public life. And while I know and I believe the country has elected a government that they feel they can trust, I think we have to be in a position where the perception is improved as well, and they can see for themselves what's going on, reach their own conclusions, and establish that degree of trust. So, Mr. Speaker, and I mentioned that it was a global phenomenon. It is very much a local phenomenon as well. You only have to go on the blogs, observe the comments in the various media to see it is an issue that people are concerned with. And I am very, very pleased that this piece of legislation will go a long ways, I think, to addressing that, addressing people's concerns, avoiding the speculation, and allowing them to trust the government they elected, trust the institutions of government, trust the organizations of government. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Attorney General talked about the elements of compliance, the culture of compliance, the success that we have had as a jurisdiction within the financial services industry. This has been demonstrated time and again, as he said. We have been assessed and assessed and assessed and assessed, both officially and unofficially. We've had academic studies done by professors around the other side of the world who found Cayman not to be wanting. Of course, that is in a business context, that is a private sector context in terms of the operations of it, although regulated by the public sector regulators. What we're doing is creating the fundamental parts of the institution of government now that will ensure that trust is there. People can't have confidence in their government until the trust is established. And this will do that. This will create the trust, will establish the trust, and will allow the confidence to develop and deepen. So, Mr. Speaker, with those truly few words, I would simply say that, as others have said, that I commend this piece of legislation to this House, to this country, because I think it is a fundamental element of restoring trust and confidence. And I'm very pleased to be part of a government that has demonstrated that it means what it says and is putting this bill in place. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to give my support to the bill before us. Mr. Speaker, when I say I mean the opposition, official opposition. No, Mr. Speaker, I don't need to leave the independent members who have spoken and put their case well before the House and gave their support to the bill. But if they want me to reiterate, then I can do that. I'm always willing to hold up the unofficial opposition when needed. No doubt, Mr. Speaker, the legislation is welcome. Mr. Speaker, just to make it absolutely clear, this bill will repeal the conflict or the register of interest legislation. One, Mr. Speaker, that I piloted in this House. That and the present and only legislation that we had where members recorded what they own, what company they were part of, what they did, is that piece of legislation. I piloted that legislation in 1996. That piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, was on the business paper of the House since '89. And we believed that we should try to put it in practice. We felt, just as I feel about this legislation, that it is something which can only contribute to the national interest and assist the preservation of public confidence in our democratic system. And I'm reading from my own words on the 17th of July, 1996. That legislation being on the books, or not on the books, on the order paper for that long. And we put a committee forward to deal, a committee of the House, to deal with that foundation piece of legislation. That committee dealing with that law had been deliberating since it was 94, when the lady member for Northside, now our deceased colleague, the late Mrs. Edna Moyle, the deputy speaker at the time, was the chairman of that committee. No doubt, Mr. Speaker, all of us as elected people, I know that we talk about elected people. I don't know why we don't spread it right across the board. And some members have managed to say that, but they zoomed in on the House, ourselves as members. They didn't really expand and say, you know, this pertains to those persons whom we appoint. And some managed to say that, as I said. But all of us are aware Mr. Speaker, that, and we felt then, as I feel now, that a law can contribute to allaying doubts as may enter on the political scene. All of us then, and since then, as I believe we are now, are aware that no matter what law we put in place, no matter what we try to do, it will never stop evil-minded persons from making unfounded allegations and telling outright lies. Those who, over the years, including now, who have had to suffer attacks and accusations on our integrity from vicious persons will continue to be targeted in that manner as long as we are in the public domain, no matter what law is in place and how close we follow it. Mr. Speaker, you have been here long enough and you've been around long enough. We would want to ensure that whatever is being complained to that committee when it's set up, or that commission, what is being complained about anyone or reported or said about anyone is said with facts, not hatred or political vendettas or for other vindictive reasons. Perception is one thing, while facts will be facts. We operate a democratic system of governance, and we will always and must always be concerned about the efficacy, the integrity, and the effectiveness of our political system. There are many factors, Mr. Speaker, when positively present, may lead to success, and when negatively absent, can lead to failure. And so I have no doubt that members here, all who campaigned on it, will leave no stone unturned to continue to contribute to the success of the system and minimize any danger of failure. On the matter of consideration of this kind of legislation, the question of private versus public interest would arise. And it will be that we have people, as has been said, appointed to boards and civil servants, police. I don't recall how far it goes. I know it don't cover the governor. I know that. But it ought to, except for the constitutional provision that disbars us from putting that in the legislation. It will be that people will feel that the invasion of privacy would be so great as to outweigh the advantage to the public interest. But over the years, from the context of the present legislation, the conflict or the register of interest, and I have mine, and I have never failed to put everything that I own and that of whatever my family own on that interest. And they have checked it and rechecked it and double-checked it and investigated and pulled under the stones, under the carpet, and it's all there and has always been all there. I have never hid anything in anybody's name or any company's name or made anybody do anything else but what I have owned and what I have been involved in. I either put it there or declared, and even when I declared it here in this legislature, I still wrote it in the interest, the registrar of interest, the only thing that we had. Mr. Speaker, as I said, all the persons that we have included in the legislation would be concerned. But we have to look at it in the wider context. My position, my attitude over was 12 years then, Mr. Speaker, back in '96. Today, it's 30 years and 5 months this year. My attitude as being elected to this honorable House are that when I entered politics, by that very act, I had turned my back on my private person and had made myself a public servant. While there is a line between our privacy and our public duty, we cannot really, well, by any stretch of the imagination, regard our entry into politics as part of an act of private surrender. Because in this day and age when some are so willing to adjudge us wrongly, our surrender to the public scrutiny must be measured in large enough quantities to, as much as is possible, show willingness on our part to be open. Many times I have to ponder, though, Mr. Speaker, how can people be so vicious? Why are some of our people, small in number though we be, so willing to think the worst of their fellow man and prepared to get up tongue-in-cheek as paragons of virtue in our island, like nobody know who they are, where they come from, what they've been doing? One of the sad traits, Mr. Speaker, in some Caymanians is that jealousy and envy run so prevalent that a person cannot own a decent home for their family or drive a decent car. And make I tell this house something and those new members something, you are lucky today that you can drive a car and you don't hear about that anymore. But the day when I entered here and the member from the outside entered the same time with me, when we got a car, you stole it or you got a whoring for it. And you were not supposed to do that. Thank God that we have progressed a bit past that, because when you come and look this car park and you see all these nice cars, oh God. Back then, you were a thief outright, my son. You shouldn't have had that. You cannot drive a decent car. You cannot own a successful business before fingers are pointed and accusations made. What it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, is that outsiders come here, own big homes, have big cars, and are made director of companies with many perks, sit on our boards, get all kinds of benefits. They got homes now that I believe you could see from the moon. It's probably one of the 8 wonders of the world. Came here with a pair of kids, one black pants and one white shirt. Caymanians do it, and don't just even say Caymanian, just say members of this house, and you done wrong to get it. Mr. Speaker, it should be a pride and joy when we find a capable Caymanian to be asked to serve as a director in a reputable institution, or to own a good home for his family, or to have a decent car, or to have a good business if they have done it all of that in the proper fashion, in the right way. Once it does not impinge upon public interest, Mr. Speaker, but it seems to me we can't do that. We mustn't do that. Caymanians, at least some, seem to think that is wrong. When we look at our history, Mr. Speaker, in this country, the practice of elected people doing political work along with their personal business has been part of our way of life for decades. Check it back. It has been accepted as legitimate for as long as we could remember. It is interesting that as long as a certain class of individuals were doing it, no murmur or protest was heard. Mr. Speaker, of course, time has evolved and there is a paradigm shift. And those of us who are good Democrats have to work with it and live with it. And we in this House are going to have to work with it and live with it, because no one need think that they will go scot-free. No matter how much they get up in this House or elsewhere and talk about how good little boys we are, that you're not going to take licks and fingers will not be pointed. Those of us who have been here long enough, if you stay here long enough, that's exactly what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen, as has happened to all of us. Mr. Speaker, never forget, my house I was re-roofing, and my house got washed away because they didn't cover up properly. In May, they were the first rains for the year, and I had to stay. And somewhere else, a couple of months until I could read, but we lost practically everything except some of the furniture, rugs, clothes, children's books. A lot of my library got swept away. And because I stayed somewhere else, they said I had owned that condo. And then the election swung in place in '96. And they said I had 2 homes, 2, up in the shores. And it became so strong that they went to the owners of the shores and said, we want to know where his 2 houses are. And I called them and said, I want to know where they are too. You tell me if you got 2 homes up here, I want to know where they are. And I needed one then, not to pay rent for 4 months or 5 months it was. So don't think that we are and would not take our licks. And so some of them, as you will find out yourselves, these instigators are very clever in their work. Not necessarily our own people either. They're clever in their work because they never actually accuse you of anything specifically. They do not make any charges, but they phrase their remarks or questions in such a way as to leave the impression that you are doing something illegal or immoral or dishonest. While they don't accuse you face to face, they are now faxing it. They are now putting it on radio shows. They now put it on the blogs. And we gulp it all down because they say so, not realizing what they're doing us. Oh, it's McKeown now, that's good. Give him all the licks. Let him take it. He deserves it, yeah. Beat the piece out of him. But when one finger is pointing, there's one in one direction, there's one pointing in the other direction most times. Something is pointing in the other direction most times. They are no respecter of persons. They will beat us, beat me, but it will be somebody else's turn later on. Oh. Tell me about that. Pray you don't have to bury one. So clearly, we ourselves cannot go around responding to every comment, explaining every allegation, challenging every remark, and explaining what you're all about. You don't know? Grandma used to say, you can lock up from a thief. That's what my grandmother used to say. You can lock up from a thief, but you cannot lock up from a liar. That is why I welcome that legislation then, and that's why I welcome the legislation now. We will always have allegations made against us. We have, somebody said it just now, we have nothing to hide. You will have your day. I have nothing to hide. Let us get the facts. Let everybody see the true picture. And then what do they do then? I know what they do. They start at somebody else. Mr. Speaker, or accuse you of something else. I certainly pay my electricity bill all the time. No, there's a song you sing in Jamaica, you know. You never hear what the young man say? Don't tie them donkey down there. Let him breathe. Mr. Speaker, we have all sorts of forces to work with or against us. I don't expect, and nor should we expect, that we are going to get everybody to support us. Never happened. So I am pleased for the legislation. Perhaps there are areas that could be made stronger. I don't know. But I like what the AG said, the Honorable Attorney General. This is a law to further preserve and promote the integrity of public officials and institutions. As I said, this piece of legislation is repealing the piece that I put in place in 1996. I was privileged also to pilot in 2003 the Complaints Commissioner legislation. That helped our democracy, and still do. So, Mr. Speaker, we appoint people to our boards, and we have to give them the wherewithal to work with. We have to be, while we have to strengthen our democracy with this sort of legislation, I have always warned against what we can't work with, making it so that we can't get anything done. People take that and twist it and turn it the way they like. But the fact is that we are only 55,000 people. The day that we can't get good people who, because good people are scared to have their names smeared and refuse to go on boards. I don't know what kind of democracy we would then have. In one of the reports the Auditor General put out, he made point to reference the point that good governance has to take into consideration our makeup, our heritage, our culture, our historical context. We know that this country, the way we developed, the way we worked, was because we had common sense people, not necessarily lawyers and doctors and accountants. We had one or two of them, and they could guide, and you would always need that. It's the best thing when you can have them. Thank God we mightn't have so many those days, but we got plenty today of our own that we can call on. But we develop with good common sense approach from those kind of people who sat on those boards because they knew the community. They knew where the house was being built. They knew who was who. And they could make their best judgment. And while people complain and talk about on the international stage, anything can be said and will be said about us on the international stage, particularly so when there is no one of us sitting in front of them to challenge them. But what they can't say, and what we shouldn't allow anybody to say, because it's not so, is that this country hasn't done well and how we have developed. Yes, there are things that are not right, and some of them coming new on the scene now. Some of the new members might think otherwise. They went to college somewhere and they saw something, and so they got a different view of it. And yes, as I said, there are those paradigm shifts. But the fact is that they themselves would not have been able to go to university and get that education that they brag about if were it not for good common sense people who stood here for 30, 40 years and done the work, developed the country, brought the revenue so that they could go and get the education overseas. So I'm not ready to take it that all has been wrong and that all is now wrong. That's why I choose a different kind of opposition, to be a different kind of opposition. No, I'm not going to do it. Because we have come too far, done too much good to allow other people to come now and try to make you believe because they're on the scene that everything is going to be fine and dandy and nothing is going wrong. No. They were only able, has been only able to get that education, to be able to contribute because somebody else paved the way for them. So when they start to talk about who they're going to look at and how they're going to look at people to sit on the boards, let us be careful. Hear what I say, because you could get people that don't have our interest at all. And if you think that's not possible, you would be sleeping all the time in these Cayman Islands. So, I am glad that the government has now brought the legislation. We didn't get it here. I don't know how far it got. Though I gave my support to the commission, but I couldn't draw up legislation. But it's here now, and I certainly support it. The opposition supports it. While I am at the point in my life, as I said, I'm not 9, I'm 59. And while I'm at the point in my life where I believe I have more yesterdays than tomorrows to look forward to, my goal is now to prepare the next generation, or to help prepare the next generation of workers, of fighters, defenders of our way of life. And whatever we do, I believe will be done in their best interests, regardless of whether it is us on this side or whether it is them on their side, on that side. I believe we all have that aim and objective, and I'm not going to stand here to decry anybody to say otherwise, because I don't believe otherwise, and I'm not going to smite or cut off my nose to smite my face. I won't do that. I'm not going to do that. Not at this point in my life. So, I look forward to committee stage. I have one attempt in the committee. As I said, I felt like the governor, who, like Duncan Taylor, received more salary and allowances. Well, Premier didn't allow, did not then, does not now, I don't think, received any allowances. They received more salary. The governor, who is entertained all over the island, at least he was, and has money to entertain whomever he wishes, and at least he did. And who can receive gifts by virtue of being top power and has more influence because he's the top power that he could peddle if he would wish or find it convenient to do so. He appoints people. We can't appoint the people that he appoints. The elected arm can't do that. So, in the interest of fairness and transparency, the governor should file a full report and should be accountable to someone to check on him. And I believe that, well, of course, that someone would be the Secretary of State. But of course, we can't do that in legislation. We can't force that in legislation. But they should do so, and I say so publicly. And then we should receive that report as members of the House, because it is our money he spends. When he has his people, his friends, down at Government House, it's our money he's spending and don't have to pay back. But I repeat, can't do that because we can't put it in legislation. But I believe that that's what ought to happen. Again, I want to thank the government. I want to thank the commission, those in the past and those present who leading the commission, those members, for coming thus far with this legislation. Again, Mr. Speaker, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll take a 10-minute break. Please be back by 5 to.